Dr. EMMA POMEROY, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup from your office in Cambridge, right here in the UK. You are an associate professor in Cambridge University, a paleoanthropologist, as well as osteoarchaeologist. We recently saw you on the very popular Netflix documentary Secrets of the Neanderthals, where we learned about Shanidar Z, a Neanderthal woman who had been buried under mysterious circumstances. Welcome to the show, Emma. You've really been in demand since the premiere of the documentary earlier this year. It must be gratifying to know that the public are still so fascinated by our Neanderthal cousins.
Absolutely. And thanks very much for having me on today. Yeah, the reception for the documentary has been really amazing. And I think people are still really intrigued. You know, Neanderthals are different, and yet they're so like us. I love the way as well the documentary showed the landscapes, the archaeology, everything in just such a beautiful way. It was really beautifully shot and well put together. It retained some of the nuances of the difficult kind of discussions and the things that we don't know. So that was absolutely wonderful.
Well, today we're going to be not only jumping back in time to look at the world of Neanderthals, but also to hear about the recent excavations within the famed Shanidar Cave in northern Iraqi Kurdistan. But before we reveal any of those secrets, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Emma, can you describe the road that has led you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in history and in the past since I was very young. And I think growing up near Canterbury in Kent sort of really fueled that and was part of that, especially with kind of the physical nature and signs of the past. So in Canterbury, there's sort of medieval city walls, there's bits of Roman archaeology, there's the cathedral, and I think that really fueled my imagination. I also had and this might sound a bit strange, but a real interest in bones from when I was very young. My mum says I was a bit of a strange kid and used to go and sort of find bits of bone from the compost heap at the end of the garden. And one of my favourite toys when I was quite young was a rubber skeleton. So as I got older and chose what to do at university, I was lucky enough to come here to Cambridge as an undergraduate and studied archaeology and anthropology. And that's where I discovered biological anthropology. And that's sort of this biological study of humans in all senses, from sort of genetics to evolution to modern behaviour. And that really sort of combined my interests in science with my interests in the past. I was then really lucky to gain experience in fieldwork, so in excavations, but also in studying human remains around the world. I've been so fortunate. So I've worked on projects in Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Croatia, and here in the UK. And those opportunities really let me develop my skills and my interests further. So yeah, I've been extremely lucky. Then when I was doing a postdoc, so that's research after you finish your PhD, I was, again, really fortunate to be offered the chance to come and work at Shanidar Cave. They'd found in the new Shanidar Cave project, which is led by Professor Graham Barker, they'd found a few bits of Neanderthal remains and so needed someone to sort of be on site for when they found potentially others. And for me, it was an amazing opportunity. I mean, Shanidar Cave's a really famous site. You learn about it as an undergraduate. I'd written essays about it. So I was really thrilled just to have the opportunity to go there and see a site I'd heard all about. And little did I sort of anticipate that actually I'd get the opportunity to help excavate and study Neanderthal remains from such an amazing site.
Okay, time to venture deep into the Shanidar Cave, a very special archaeological site indeed, with excavations going right back to the 1950s. Emma, what is the story of the Shanidar Cave?
So the first excavations at Shanidar Cave were, as you said, in the 1950s. They were led by an American archaeologist, Ralph Selecki, and he started his excavations there in 1952 and excavated 4 field seasons up until 1960. And the site became really famous because of his work. He discovered the remains of 9 Neanderthal individuals, men and women, children as well. And another was added actually that was discovered amongst the animal bones in the 2000s. So Shanidar 1 to 10, these individuals became known as. And they featured really centrally in major debates about Neanderthal behaviour and their ability to sort of think like us, things like that. So, for example, the individual called Shanidar 1 was discovered to have major injuries. So he'd suffered a blow to his head, which may well have left him blind in one eye. He was also paralysed down one arm and probably lost that arm from just above the elbow. He had arthritis. He was probably had hearing problems. He had an infection in one of his bones. And yet he survived to a pretty good age for a Neanderthal. So the finding of Shanidar 1 was really important in discussions about, well, did Neanderthals care for their fellow members of the community? Another individual that became really famous was one known as Shanidar 4. So some people refer to this as the flower burial, because when they excavated the remains, Selecki's team took samples of the sediment from around the body, and when those were analysed, it was found that there were clusters of pollen. And these kind of clusters of pollen weren't found anywhere else on the site. So the interpretation by Selecki and the paleontologist and the pollen specialist Arlette Leroy-Gorin was that this was evidence of flowers having been put under the body when it was buried. And of course, that's very sort of modern behaviour to us. That's something we can really identify with, putting flowers in a grave. But it was very controversial. Some people argued that maybe it was modern contamination. Other people argued that maybe it was burrowing rodents that dragged flowers into their burrows. So this became an issue of huge debate, and many people became sceptical about the flowers. One of the other interesting things about this Shanidar 4 flower burial that gets much less attention is that actually Shanidar 4 was part of a cluster of individuals. There were also parts of 2 probably female adults, Shanidar 6 and Shanidar 8, and part of a baby, Shanidar 9. However, our understanding of those individuals and how, physically the remains related to each other is somewhat limited, because the bones of Shanidar 4 were so fragile when they first found them that they decided to remove those using a method called en bloc. So basically, you remove the whole block of sediment from the site intact. And to do that, you have to cut around the edges, put boards all around it and underneath to support the sediment. And then what that means is that you can take that whole block to somewhere else, so it's a bit easier to excavate it, for example, a lab. But in doing so, they hadn't quite realised how much parts of other individuals were underneath Shanidar 4. So as they cut that block out, they found these kind of extra bones trickling out. And that's when they realised there were multiple individuals. So sort of jump forward in history to the 2010s, and that's when the current Shanidar Cave project began at the invitation of the Kurdish regional government. And later, sort of in 2016, we actually identified some more remains sort of right next to where that block containing Shanidar 4 had been cut out. And these became known as Shanidar Z to us in the UK, or perhaps Z if you're North American. And that's been really exciting, because here was an opportunity to really investigate with all modern science what actually happened to these individuals when they died.
Okay, so the main things are, we've got the left forearm here, the carpals, bones of the wrist here, and then the palm of the hand, metacarpals, and the phalanges here, so it's bent right back on itself. We've also got some of the ribs here, part of the left scapula and right scapula, a first rib here, I think, with a lithic sitting very close to it.
And where was the skull, the crushed skull?
And the skull was sort of spread across here, so the front of the face is probably here, the back of the skull somewhere over here, and the jaw more or less here.
In 2020, more finds were announced to the world, including an individual dubbed Shanidar Z, or Z. A Neanderthal woman, Shanidar Z, eventually was reconstructed and given a face. So what do we know about this individual, and how was she found?
So from her remains, what we know already is that she was an older individual, probably in her 40s, which doesn't seem that old to us today. But that was a pretty good age for a Neanderthal, as far as we can tell. We know that because her teeth were extremely worn down. Some of her front teeth don't have any of the white bit, the crown left. They're completely worn down to little stubs of roots. We also know that she's probably female, based on the size of the skeleton, but also on analysis of the tooth enamel. So there's differences in the proteins depending on whether you have two X chromosomes or whether you have an X and Y chromosome. And the evidence we have for Shanidar Z is that there was no Y chromosome, so only the X version of these proteins. As I mentioned before, she was found in 2016. That's when we first saw the remains, and where they were was in the edge of the trench, so the edge of the excavation. If you imagine the big wall of where we've been digging, we saw the remains in that wall, this kind of cluster of what looked like the outline of a rib cage and some bones from a hand. But the nature of the site meant that actually we couldn't excavate those remains fully at that point. So it wasn't until 2018 that we then were able to sort of excavate down from above, because that's the best way to actually see the remains and understand how they got to be there, and everything we can. So yes, 2018 we excavated down, and that's when we actually found that there was a skull, which was very exciting because we hadn't been able to tell that from the wall of the cave. It was a huge challenge as well, because actually the skull had been completely squashed. So it was around sort of 2 centimeters thickness in total. And all of the bone was extremely fragile, very, very hard to excavate, very soft and softer than the sediment around it. So what we had to do was use something called a consolidant. So this is like a glue, if you imagine, and it kind of soaks into the bone and strengthens it from the inside, meaning that we can actually lift it out of the ground. But it also soaks into the sediment, the soil around the bones, and so kind of glues all of that together. So what we had to do was then remove those bones with the sediment attached in small blocks. We could have removed the whole thing in one big block like Selecki had done with Shanadar 4, but there are risks with that. So we might have lost information about how the body was placed and whether it might have been a burial. It's also quite hard to lift a big block up from 7.5 meters down a big trench. So that's why we eventually decided that this lifting of small consolidated blocks was the way to go. And once we'd lifted sort of these little packages, we found that actually it was the whole upper body of this female individual, but that she'd been cut off at the waist. So we had her left arm, and that was kind of tucked under the head. We had her rib cage, but as I said, cut through at the waist. And that we think, we're very confident, was because the rest of her body probably went underneath where Shanadar 4 was. And that cut edge in the side of the trench was where Selecki's team had cut out that block containing Shanadar 4 back in 1960. So that means that there's a strong possibility that some of the remains that have been called Shanadar 6 or Shanadar 8 that were part of that cluster with Shanadar 4 might actually be part of Shanadar Z. However, that's not something that we've been able to resolve to date, so watch this space. Some of the other interesting things we were able to learn about Shanidar Z was that there's evidence that she was intentionally buried. So one of the debates about Neanderthals that's been going on for a long, long time is how similar were they to us in terms of how they thought, how they behaved, were they capable of compassion? Did they mourn their dead? And what we were able to see by taking out a small block of the sediment intact and then impregnating that with wax, taking very thin microscope slides of that whole block, we can then analyse the structure of the sediments. And what we learned was that there was evidence that actually Shanidar Z was laid in probably a small kind of natural water channel, but that actually someone had dug out that water channel to make it a bit bigger to fit her body in. So that's starting to show us good evidence that actually she was intentionally placed. And the fact that her skeleton was so intact, so all the bones were still in the right place, shows us that she was covered over quite soon after she died, which again suggests that there's some intentional behaviour and treatment of the body going on. So that's really interesting. We also found some more remains. So those remains of Shanidar Z were published first in 2020, but since then, when we returned in 2022, about 10 centimetres below Shanidar Z, we actually found some very incomplete remains, but what we think is a part of another individual, which we've called for now Shanidar A. This is just a shoulder blade, so a scapula, a few ribs, some scattered teeth, and a really complete right hand. And it's actually that right hand that you can see in the Netflix documentary that the BBC produced. You can see me excavating that in the footage. So from there, we've had major challenges. As I said, the bone was really, really soft and very hard to excavate. It's one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, I think. And there's that whole pressure of this being such an important find, and yet so hard to work with. So very kindly, the Department of Antiquities in Iraqi Kurdistan gave us permission to bring all those remains back to the UK. And here we've been able to scan them with a micro CT scanner. So that's kind of like the CT scan that you might have had in a hospital, but it's much higher resolution. So we can check what's in each of those little packages that we've removed, see what the bones are like underneath. And then we had the most wonderful conservator work with us, Lucia Lopez-Paulin, and she's also in the documentary. And she did the most fantastic job of cleaning the bones in those packages, but also making sure that they didn't fall apart, so stabilising them, consolidating them. And this is really remarkable work. I mean, basically what she has to do is remove the consolidant, sort of the glue that we put in on site, at the same time as not removing so much that the bone just falls apart, but removing enough so that you can clean it. It's really highly skilled work. And then what she did, and I helped with as well, was trying to fit all these fragments back together. And really the work is remarkable. When we first found Shanidar Z's skull, people said to me, "Oh, do you think you'll be able to reconstruct it to, its original form?" And I sort of said, "Oh yes, that would be fine," thinking, what am I saying? And yet, thanks to Lucia's work, I mean, we really do have a 3D skull now. And from that, what we were able to do is create a 3D surface model, so use a 3D scanner essentially to make a digital copy of that skull. Those digital files we then sent over to the amazing Kennis brothers, who are really famous for their facial reconstructions of human ancestors. They then printed out that 3D model at their end and did a reconstruction of what Shanidar Z might have looked like. And this too is really amazing work. So basically what they do is sort of add on the muscles where they would have been, the soft tissue, the skin, the fat underneath our skin, add hair. And from their work, we've then got this amazing representation of how Shanidar Z might have looked when she was alive. There's aspects of that are artistic interpretation, of course. We can never know, how she had her hair, what her personality was like. I love the fact that in this reconstruction, she looks quite thoughtful, but also friendly at the same time. But actually, we don't have any evidence of what her skin colour was, for example. We just have the skeletal remains. But we can make an educated guess. So she was a woman who, lived a relatively long life out in the open, hunting, gathering. So it's likely that actually she did have quite a tanned complexion and some wrinkles and the odd grey hair. And that's exactly how the Kenneth brothers have reconstructed her. So yeah, really wonderful to have that impression of how she might have looked. I really think it helps us connect with her as a person, not just a collection of bones. We're still trying to figure out, exactly when her remains were buried in Shanidar Cave. But from what we can tell, this was about 75,000 years ago. So that's really quite remarkable, and we're working on refining that date even further.
Isn't it true, Emma, that you did a little drawing of the position that you found her in?
Yes, so that was just a little sketch trying to represent how the body would have been at the time that Shanidar Z was placed in the ground. I'm not the greatest artist, but it was just to give an impression. And what you can see in that drawing is the stone behind Shanidar Z's head. This is an interesting stone because one of the things we're trying to figure out is whether that might have been put there on purpose, perhaps as some kind of marker of where the body was. Because what's quite remarkable, actually, is that, as I've mentioned, Shanidar Z's part of this cluster, and part of that same cluster as Shanidar 4, the flower burial. And we have evidence now that there's at least 5 individuals there. But what's also really interesting is that we have evidence too that Neanderthals were coming back to that exact spot in the cave to place bodies at different times. Now, that's really quite remarkable. The cave is enormous. So, it's kind of like an aircraft hangar. And yet, multiple times, Neanderthal bodies are being placed within a space that's maybe 1 meter by 1 meter by 50 centimeters deep. So how do they know to do that? That marker stone might be a part of that. Another thing that's worth observing is that actually all of these remains, so Shanidar Z, Shanidar A, Shanidar 4, 6, 8, 9, are all behind a big vertical stone that would have stood maybe up to 2 meters tall from the cave floor at the time the bodies were put there. And it's right in the center of the cave. So perhaps that's another kind of marker that may have been used in deciding or remembering where those bodies have been placed.
Emma, you are an osteoarchaeologist, which basically means you uncover buried bones. Removing these remains entails a lot more than trowels and brushes. It's really a forensic operation, isn't that right?
Absolutely. It's really painstaking work, not only because we're trying to preserve the bones themselves and they're very delicate, especially in the case of Shanidar Z, as we've already talked about, but because we're trying to find out as much as we can during the excavation about that individual, how they were placed in the ground, what that process was like. Was it intentional? Has someone buried them intentionally? Have they just died of natural causes and perhaps then decomposed naturally out in the open? So to do this, what we use is a whole range of actually similar techniques to what's used in forensic science. So we take samples of the sediment, the soil around the bones, to look at the chemistry, for example, that can tell us something about how the body decomposed. We also do things like the sediment micromorphology that I mentioned before. So taking out a block of that sediment, cutting a thin slice, looking at that under a microscope, because actually the microscopic structure of the sediment can tell us something about whether the hole or the place they were put was dug out intentionally. And actually we see evidence of that in Shanidar Z. So if you imagine sort of digging out a little hole, you can imagine that you compress the sediment underneath that you've just taken out, right? You push down as you're digging. And we can see signs of that in the sediment micromorphology. There's also other interesting things we can do. And this might sound a bit unpleasant, but actually, if we look closely at how the body has decomposed, we can get an idea of the kind of environment it was in. So Was the body covered over with sediment soon after death? Was part of it left exposed? And this draws a lot on forensic science, on forensic anthropology, and there's actually a whole field called archaeothanatology, which is basically studying how the body decomposes and what we can learn from that. So if you imagine, as the body decomposes, the soft tissue, the muscles, the skin, the organs decompose, and if it's covered over with sediment, they leave a space, a void. And so other things can fall into that space. And sometimes that's the bones. So the bones can actually shift from precisely where they were in the body to slightly different positions. And by knowing how the body decomposes, which joints actually break down quicker than others, we can start to say something about, whether that individual was in fact covered over with sediment as they decomposed, whether it's been exposed on the surface, and actually there's signs in the bones that that was the case. We can look for evidence of things like carnivores or even rodents sort of attacking the bones, and that can tell us something as well about whether they were exposed or covered over. So by taking this really detailed and painstaking approach, not only to the bones themselves, but to the whole kind of context that they're in, all the sediments around them, we can actually learn far more about that individual and about the perhaps cultural processes involved in how the body was treated than if we just prioritise the bones on their own and miss the rest of that kind of wealth of evidence. Of course, archaeology, we just get one go, right? It's destructive by nature. Once we've excavated it once, we can't go back and say, actually, let's just do that again and check exactly where this was. So we have to go through, take the samples we need at the time and document everything very carefully, which can take quite a long time and can be very painstaking, as I said.
Emma, the view of Neanderthals has really changed over the years. Originally seen as brutish creatures with very little intelligence, they are now seen as much smarter and much more intuitive. But there's still a great deal of misunderstanding about this species, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right. If we think about, common language usage, if you refer to someone as a bit of a Neanderthal, you're not being complimentary, right? So I think that idea of them being sort of your archetypal caveman or cavewoman still really persists. And even in research, actually, there has been a bit of a bias. We've assumed that modern humans, us, have been sort of more intelligent, more successful. That's why we're the only ones left today, whereas Neanderthals have died out. And that's even sort of permeated and got into the science itself. So some people have argued, since the 90s, that actually some of the characteristics of Neanderthal bodies that we find when we find a skeleton, if we found a modern human skeleton in exactly the same position and with the exact same things around it, we wouldn't question whether that was a burial and something meaningful and something that had been done on purpose. But when we find a Neanderthal that way, suddenly it's a double standard and we're sort of questioning, was this intentional, or is this just someone who's died, a natural death? And coming back to this idea that, humans were the ones who were successful and Neanderthals just went extinct, and so we were somehow superior to them, is really being challenged by some of the recent evidence. So, for example, genetic work has showed that actually Neanderthals and modern humans interbred for the first time much earlier than we thought. So we previously thought this happened around sort of 40 to 50,000 years ago, just before Neanderthals went extinct. But actually now we have evidence that this happened much earlier as well. So a separate occasion, perhaps as early as sort of 200,000 years ago. So that tells us that probably modern humans had gone into Europe and Asia, where we find Neanderthals, and bred with them, but not survived there long term. So in that case, it was actually the Neanderthals who survived. And again, we have some fossil evidence. It's a bit controversial, but it's from a site in Greece called Apidema. And there again, we have a skull that some people would argue is already modern human. Again, that's evidence that modern humans had sort of made a foray, if you like, a journey into Europe and Asia, most likely, but had not managed to establish themselves there long term. So if we focus only on the sort of 40,000, 50,000 years ago, when modern humans came into Eurasia and then were actually successful in staying there while Neanderthals went extinct, we're missing a big part of the story, that actually modern humans had been into Eurasia much, much earlier, but had not succeeded in actually establishing themselves there.
Well, it's been wonderful diving into the world of the Shanidar Cave with all its mysteries, and I just want to thank you, Emma, for taking the time to come on to the show today. So, what's next for you, and what's next for Shanidar Cave?
Well, our analysis of Shanidar Z, Shanidar A, and the Neanderthal remains that we have from Shanidar Cave are really still at the beginning. There's many more things we hope to learn from those remains. For example, about these individuals' health, both in general terms, but also specifically their oral health, so their dental health. And we're collaborating with various colleagues to look at things like the calculus. So that's the mineralized plaque, the stuff that your dental hygienist or dentist will clean off your teeth. Actually, that's a really exciting resource for us because it traps bits of food, DNA from the things we're eating, and bacteria that live in our mouths. So that's something that we're working on to learn more about, people's health in the past. We're also doing more work looking at things like the isotopes, so the different chemical forms in the teeth and in the bone, to learn about what these individuals were eating, but also perhaps where they came from. So Neanderthal populations were pretty mobile. They moved around the landscape, hunting and gathering. So one of the interesting questions is, well, was Shanidar Z sort of born locally and grew up locally, or had she actually moved quite a long distance during her lifetime? There's also many lab analyses still to come. My colleagues are still working on the pollen remains, some of the burnt plant remains, for example. We had some really exciting results come out from that about cooking of plant foods. And yeah, there's an awful lot more to do. The excavation process is really just the start of things and generates many years of subsequent lab work to really answer all those questions we have about, Neanderthals, how they were living at the cave, what the environment was like when they were there, how it changed over time. So much more still to do. And the excavations are actually still ongoing. So we go back for about a month every year. And at the moment, we're focused on trying to understand the period in which Neanderthals stopped visiting the cave and which modern humans started to use the cave. At other sites in Eurasia, we have evidence that Neanderthals and modern humans were using the same sites, but sort of one after the other, and you get this kind of alternation of them using sites. So what was going on at Shanidar? Can we see evidence of that? Or was it just that Neanderthals stopped using the cave and then modern humans turn up later? So much more to do, many more exciting results to come, I would hope. So yeah, watch this space.
Dr. EMMA POMEROY, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's been really great chatting to you.